think he's one of the finest Indian diplomats who was on the scene in the modern era. He arrived here in the US at a time, I would say, of great tumult, and he navigated the landscape with care and skill and with a great sense of history. He is a historian and an author, and so it's great to see him on the screen here. And then Richard Fontaine, let me just say, one of the best strategic thinkers in Washington. Richard, we wait for your writings and events each week. You have been critical to shaping U.S. national security over the years, and you've been a friend for 2 decades. But let me also say you had the best boss and mentor in Senator McCain, and one of the most consequential senators, I think, that we've had in the last 50 years, if not longer, and an early champion of U.S.-India ties. And the fact that he didn't yell at me during my Senate confirmation hearing, I still attribute as a sign of success. So let me get on to your question directly, which is the direction of the Indo-US relationship. And I think it's always good to take stock. And here I think I should pause and just thank all of the great people at the State Department, the Defense Department, the embassy in Delhi, the ambassador, for the job that they continue to do. Because clearly we're on a 2-decade, I think, upward trajectory, no question about it. So to answer your question directly, yes, linear and upward. But embedded in your question was also the word estranged. And we use that word estranged sometimes when we talk about the US-India relationship, because there's a great book by Dennis Cucks, and it's a classic work called Estranged Democracies, the US and India. And it describes a period of estrangement in US-India ties in the 1960s and 70s. It didn't come through any of the breakthroughs, didn't cover any of the breakthroughs that came late in the Clinton administration through the current day. And there was deep estrangement in our ties in the Johnson-Nixon era. But I also want to go back to a time before estrangement, because we tend to ignore this part of history, and that was when we had deep convergence with 2 presidents, President Eisenhower and President Kennedy. And both saw the importance of the US-India relationship. Both saw the promise of US-India ties. In fact, when I met with Susan Eisenhower last year, she recalls that President Eisenhower used to talk about how he wanted to travel to India throughout the course of his presidency, and that it was the one place he wanted to go, and he was the first US president to go there. And of course, we know of President Kennedy's fondness for India, his appointment of John Kenneth Galbraith, and the First Lady's historic trip there. But I want to answer your question by leaving you perhaps with 2 quotes, one from Eisenhower and one from Kennedy, to measure how we're doing today. First, with Kennedy. Kennedy, even before he became president, gave a stirring speech on the Senate floor where he talked about the hinge of fate in Asia rests with India. The hinge of fate in Asia rests with India because it is a democracy and because it is a friend. And it shaped Kennedy's view that we had to strongly support India, and he did that throughout his presidency. And so when there was a conflict in 1962 between India and China, Kennedy was first to step up to the plate, and in a series of exchanges with Prime Minister Nehru, committed arms, ammunition, logistical support, deployed the 7th Fleet, and was there at a time when India needed us. Second, an Eisenhower quote. And when he came to India in 1959, he talked about the importance of treating people with respect, no matter who they were, where they come from, what they looked like. And he ultimately said it is the people-to-people ties that will drive the US-India relationship. So the hinge of fate in Asia rests with India, and the people-to-people ties will drive the US-India relationship. I just want us to think about whether we are living up to those quotes and those aspirations. Are, for example, the recent moves on immigration, on student visas, on spousal visas, are we taking care of people the way that President Eisenhower encouraged us to take care of people and respect people regardless of where they come from? When India and China have such a significant crisis and the US president offers mediation as if both sides are to blame, are we really standing up the way that President Kennedy would have stood up and unequivocally defended and supported and advanced US-India ties? I have some real questions about both of those commitments. And so I leave you with those questions because I think those two presidents, one Republican, one Democrat, laid out how we should think about how we treat people and how we treat the importance of the strategic relationship. So I'll stop there.
Well, thanks so much. And it's interesting that you make those points because the last webinar we had here at the Synergia Foundation was with Mr. Joseph Nye, who on his book, Do Morals Matter, also raises the points and mentions the points that you have made just now. Ambassador Sarna, how does the view look from Delhi? The questions that Mr. Verma has raised, what would be the answer from New Delhi or the observation from New Delhi? You need to unmute yourself, sir.
Thank you so much. Am I audible?
Yes, you are. You are.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Thank you. A lot of familiar faces. Thank you, Richard, for those very kind words that you mentioned. I remember calling on you before I left on my post in the United States, and you were still in post in Delhi. And you gave me some guidance as to how to walk around in Washington, which I was going back to after about 14 years. And some things had changed drastically and some things had not. And I think that's what I probably come down to. And thank you. Pleasure to be with you, Richard, on the panel. And since your mentor, Senator McCain, was mentioned, I should say that some of the best meetings I had in the Senate were with Senator McCain. And the first time I met him, he was that day something had happened, I forget what, because something was happening every day. He was very, very angry with President Trump. And he said, this president forgets that there are three parts to this government. And, he made his point of the Senate, and he was very, very fond of India. He gave us time whenever we wanted, so we missed him a lot when he was no longer there. I think you're absolutely right. We have to, this pandemic has made us forget a lot of things. And we forget, for instance, that frankly, it was only 4 months ago that President Trump and Prime Minister Modi were sharing the stage in Ahmedabad. And, besides the hoo-ha of the visit, there was a fair amount of substance that was talked about. And frankly, but leaving personalities aside, I think what Rich mentioned about both the Republican and the Democratic administrations, going back to Eisenhower and Kennedy, I think the same thing has carried on very definitely for the last 20 odd years. You mentioned the book Strange Democracies. In fact, when I reached Washington in '98, just after our nuclear tests, Ambassador Dennis Cox used to be a frequent visitor both to our embassy and to various think tank meetings. And I have this distinct impression that he was a trifle bemused, a trifle confused, because he had written this book which showed the differences that India and the United States had for 50 years. And then suddenly, in 98, things were beginning to change at the most unlikeliest of triggers, a nuclear test. And you know, so there was everything that had been happening till 92, till the end of the Cold War, that we happened to be on the wrong side of history at various crucial times, was suddenly beginning to change. There was a beginning of understanding each other. There was a curiosity about India. There was a curiosity about the India-Pakistan relationship. There was a curiosity about India's nuclear and defense and security needs. And there was a curiosity about India's potential as an economy, as an IT superpower, and so on. And that was really the changing point where the word estranged seems to have, thankfully, dropped off. And I don't think it's coming back, pandemic or no pandemic. Because for the last 20 years, if I put the line at the visit of President Clinton to India, I think there has been a steady upward graph. Rich mentioned already some of the reasons, but I think the fundamental reason is that the United States dropped, a certain view of India, and India dropped a certain view of the United States that we had kept close to ourselves. And the world was changing, and we decided to change with it. And I think when you sit in Washington and you look towards this part of the world, there's only one country really with the size, with the heft, with the comfort, whether it's the comfort of people-to-people relations or it's the comfort of a steadily growing defense and security relationship, except India, which also has the potential of being a reliable strategic partner through the years. So I think, frankly, that when the pandemic, if and when it is over, and in fact, let me add in a factor, no matter what happens in the US elections, I think there may be a bump here or there, but quickly the strategic logic of this relationship will come to the fore. And I think the story of the India-US relationship will continue. If you've asked me the three words, estranged, linear, and closer, I think I would settle for something between linear and closer. I would say, if it's not going to be normal business only, and that's why I move a bit towards closer, because there have been challenges during this pandemic. There have been strategic challenges for us. There have been domestic challenges, both for India and the United States, in terms of the health infrastructure and various issues related to the pandemic. So there may be a change in nuance. There would be a change in areas of cooperation. There would be certain picking up of where we left off in February. Some things may go on the back burner, maybe for budgeting reasons, for attention reasons, and some things may come up in front. But broadly, I think we are going to stay the path. And I think the two quotations that Rich mentioned, I think are very appropriate. President Trump, I think despite his proclivity to bring up trade and immigration issues in a disproportionately large and somewhat unfriendly manner, does understand the logic behind the India relationship. And of course, if we get Joe Biden, I think then we go back to a more classical foreign policy situation in which things should fall into place fairly soon, with a change of nuance, let me add that.
Right. Thanks. Interesting. You are saying it will not be impacted by the elections greatly. We will pick that point up a little further. Now, shifting to Richard Fontaine. As you answer that question, and being a fan of your writing myself, in one of your articles in 2019, you called India the bright spot in Trump's foreign policy, the only bright spot perhaps in Trump's foreign policy. Do you still hold that view? Has that changed? And what is your prediction for the future?
Well, thanks for having me. It's great to be here with you and with Toby and with Ambassador Sarna. It's great to see you and talk over these issues with you, and especially with my friend Rich Verma, who, as everybody knows, was a truly spectacular ambassador to India, and was spectacular at the State Department before that, and on Capitol Hill before that, and now at the private sector. So it's an honor to be on the same panel speaking about these issues with him. I stand by the notion that U.S.-India relations, generally speaking, are one of the bright spots of the Trump administration. That's not to say that they're unblemished, to be sure, because in this administration, as we've seen in others, but to a greater degree in this administration, issues that don't on their face have a lot to do with India because they're decisions that have been made in Washington, not specifically because of India, like on visa policy and things like that, also on trade, end up harming or at least having the potential to arrest some of the momentum. But if you stand back and look at the overall trend line over the past 20 plus years, you would be hard pressed to find an issue in US foreign policy that has maintained momentum across different administrations in Washington and different administrations in a place like India. So, you know, the transformation of US-India relations that began under Bill Clinton and then was sustained under George W. Bush and Barack Obama and Donald Trump, and now even very recently Joe Biden has said if he's elected, strengthening and deepening US-India relations would be a top priority for him. I mean, show me another issue that has sustained support across such vastly different presidencies. And of course, the same thing is true on the Indian side, from Atal Bihari Vajpayee through Manmohan Singh and Narendra Modi. I mean, show me a foreign policy issue that has been sustained. And so what you see here is, on the American side at least, a long-term strategic bet that closer US-India ties are in the interest of the United States, that has been sustained across very different administrations in the United States and different administrations in India, shifting geopolitical calculations and conditions. And the momentum has been sustained. That's not to say it has been wholly linear, because as we all know, there are ups and there are downs, and there are ups and there are downs, but the general trend line is one of closer relations. And the question, of course, is why is that the case? And the obvious answer, I think, is because both sides see an overwhelming interest in closer ties with each other, particularly as the geopolitical conditions change across the Indo-Pacific. And, you know, what you have at root is two great democracies that believe that they'll be better off working more closely together than they would be otherwise. And that means doing work together more closely on security relations, diplomatically, economically, people to people, all of these kinds of things. And the key here in this administration especially is to try to limit the sort of downward pressure that some of these divisive issues, like the ones that Rich Verma mentioned, like visa policy and things like that, limit the downward pressure that those kind of issues may put on the relationship, and actually look for the other areas of opportunity here. So, you know, in the China-India standoff, there's an opportunity to actually bring the United States and India closer in some ways, even in sort of tactical ways like intelligence sharing and ultimately in defense sales and things like that. So when I step back from this and you look around the world and ask, where are things going relatively well? You start to scratch your head. It's pretty hard to think about areas where things are going relatively well. And I would put the overall trend line of closer US-India ties in that unfortunately rather small category.
Right, but may I just add a subsequent question to what you've been saying before we go to the second big question that we're going to ask? Have we factored in the fact that the US's stature as the world leader seems to be a threat at the moment. And given the fact that, yes, so far it has followed a continuum irrespective of who has been in power or which side has been in power, and that's true, it's because of strategic interests. But do those change in a post-pandemic world where the US stature as a world leader seems to be a threat? Is that something that needs to be considered or factored into this relations? Richard Fontaine first this time.
Sure. Well, the notion of America as a declining power on the world stage is a pretty common theme, more among Americans than anyone else. We always tend to think that, our time is over, our day is gone, and all of this. This time could be different, but every time we've thought this so far, it hasn't been the case. The American capacity for renewal, the strength of the U.S. economy, the ambition of American foreign policy, and all of this wrapped together has always sort of led to us living another day, so to speak, particularly because other countries have their own problems, and you look around the world into who would step into a leadership role when the United States steps back, and there's not a huge number of obvious candidates. That said, I think the current time is a particularly damaging one for the United States and its stature around the world, both from a lack of leadership on the international scene, but from an appearance of basic incompetence on our domestic scene. And those things are not going to just be wished away. But I don't know that that has to in any way inhibit the growth of the U.S.-India relationship. I mean, in a way, when you start to worry about your own power and standing, you look even more for friends. And so from at least the American side, I think that if nothing else, it would make us look harder at who the countries are out there like India that share the basic values that the United States shares and have the kind of strategic weight and heft to make a difference in the world that we would want to be closer to rather than further away from.
Richard Verma, as you go into points of divergence and confluence, you've already mentioned a few, the sticking points in your earlier comments, but could you also address this larger issue that the entire prediction of the path for Indo-US relations is also dependent on the prediction on the path for US's stature as a world power in the coming years? Richard Verma.
Yeah, thank you. I tend to agree with Richard that I am not as worried about the decline of the United States, right? I am worried, however, about whether the American people still want to play a major role in international affairs. And I think they do, and I think this is where President Trump has misread the mood of the electorate. There's no question that over the last 20 years or so, the American people became war weary. They became skeptical of our commitments overseas, particularly in the Middle East. They were skeptical about globalization. And so there was naturally going to be some rebalancing and a pullback in what the US does around the world. But I don't think anyone predicted that the US would not only pull back, but in the process try to upset and upend the global order as well. Fareed Zakaria has written that perhaps the greatest threat to the liberal post-war order is in fact the United States and its breaking of the institutions and alliances that we actually developed and helped keep the post-world order secure and prosperous. And you can just look in the last 3.5 years of every agreement that we have pulling out of the World Health Organization in the middle of a pandemic, pulling out of the nuclear agreements with Russia, the Iran nuclear agreement, the Paris Climate Agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, defunding our international institutions. So I think that course has to be corrected immediately. And it would be corrected by a mainstream Republican. It would certainly be corrected by Vice President Biden. There's no question about it. So I do think if we continue on that course, India will have to look at our reliability And that certainly has been called into question. So let me just talk a little bit about confluence and divergence. Look, I think we are still natural partners, but this is not mainly or exclusively about strategic interests or buying and selling to each other or the trade deficit. If we want this relationship to be different, and I do think it's different, we have to go back to those values that actually pull us together. And those values didn't start 20 years ago or 30 years ago. Actually, our great scholars and thinkers and philosophers actually shared the ideas that brought us together today. And let me mention really 2 or 3 areas. The first is on social justice, right? If you think about our writers, Emerson and Thoreau and others, and how they influenced Gandhi and other leaders of the Indian freedom movement, it was about inclusivity, diversity, equal rights, social justice, speaking out for the oppressed. Secondly, it was about democracy. And that's why our 2 constitutions start with the same 3 words. That's why your drafters of the Constitution came to the United States to study the best elements of ours and take back and adapt to form an Indian constitution. That's why we both have federal systems, the rule of law, civilian oversight of our military. We are bonded as democratic partners. And third, yes, our strategic interests. And this is what has developed over the last 20 years, the concept of a free and open Indo-Pacific, a rules-based order. This is what Senator McCain was so focused about. But we can't lose sight of those issues of social justice and democracy as well. Otherwise, we will just become a buyer-seller relationship, a transactional relationship, and I don't think anybody wants that. Now, where I'd like to see us go, I'd like to see us do more operationally. That means in the defense space, I don't want to just buy and sell stuff with each other. Yes, we do a lot of exercises, but it's time to actually do things with each other, perhaps on humanitarian disaster response, perhaps it's on more burden sharing around the world. That does not mean joint patrols in the South China Sea. That does mean doing more together operationally from a military perspective. I think we're ready for that. Secondly, I think we should do more from a development perspective. We should work in third countries on a development agenda and on a democracy agenda, and we can certainly do that. So 3 Ds, defense, development, and democracy, and it means thinking about our relationship beyond just bilateral. That's where I'd like to go. And finally, I can't imagine a modern relationship that doesn't focus on clean energy. And selling of LNG does not really check the box on clean energy. We can do a lot more. That's important. But look, China has become the world's leading producer of renewable energy. The US and India are natural clean energy partners, and I'd love to see that account get back on track. So I'll stop there.
Right, Mr. Sarna, economics and the value of all this from an Indian point of view, the fact that there is, the sense of trust with the US leadership as a world leader has been questioned. Will that factor into the way India looks at Washington, D.C., as you talk about divergence and points of confluence?
Well, inevitably, the world has taken into account the unpredictability of President Trump's foreign policies. And, I must say that it's not just India that has had to discount for it, if I may say so. relationships on an even keel, despite this amount of turbulence. So I think even India has understood that this has been a turbulent time. And there are certain, we have to watch our flank on various, reversals and pullbacks, etc., that may happen. But the effort, I think, has been to keep your eye on the meat and let that keep moving steadily forward while riding out the wave on some issues. That isn't, and if the U.S. leadership, U.S. does withdraw as it is doing, withdraw from leadership of global forums and from the new liberal international order that it actually created, then yes, something will have to be done. Some other countries will have to move into the breach. And perhaps, US may withdraw from leadership, but US is not going to go and live on another planet. Their concerns are still going to be still there. And whether it is the WHO, whether it is pandemics, whether it is climate change, I think the people of the United States will certainly feel the need to meet these concerns. So I think partners will become even more important for the United States if they were to completely withdraw and if this is not reversed. Coming to divergences and confluences, I think if Richard has already said, put it into the philosophical framework, and I won't repeat that. But I would say that in terms of divergences, the two things that do stand out, and unless they are reversed with a change in administration, one is the undue stress on issues like trade balance, on market access as kind of deal breakers. I mean, these have always been there. Listen, the US-India relationship has always had trade differences. We've always had IPR differences. We've had, issues like child labor and so on, as far as one can remember. But these have always been budgeted into the larger relationship. So I think that is where we need to park this trade basket while we move ahead on it. The second is the issue of, the broad issue of immigration, jobs, travel, students, H-1B visas. I think a certain amount of setback on that is expected. You have 40 million Americans applying for unemployment benefits. And there is going to be a certain resistance about foreigners coming to take jobs. I think that is it's an unprecedented, in recent terms, contraction of the US economy. So I think Indian industry will have to budget for that. We'll have to adjust to that. Right. And I know certainly on the H-1B visa, they already have been doing. Right. These are two issues, jobs and immigration, on which I think there will be divergence. There are other issues which have sort of gone under the carpet because of the pandemic. And the issue of Afghanistan, for instance. Have Indian interests been taken care of in talking to the Taliban? That is going to be a major problem. Our maritime security in what is happening in the Indo-Pacific. How far are we going to be able to go with the United States in the Indo-Pacific without, we've always worried about upsetting China. At the moment, we are very upset with China. So how far can we go in the current mood? I mean, that is a space I would like to watch. You want to come in?
Yeah, I just want to ask you a very quick question about that point. You say that we are very upset about China, so that determines how far we're going to go. Is the level of upset that we have with China at the moment going to push the levels, or is that something that's going to be a very temporary phase that's going to be taking us back to one where we're going to balance? What's your prediction?
I think it's a very good question. And I feel we are at an inflection point. We are showing much more, a forward positioning on, for instance, the Quad. And I think this is something which we probably will stay with in the immediate to medium term, unless there is a complete reversal of the India-China relationship as it stands at the moment. I don't think these relationships change so fast. So I would say that we can look forward to a closer partnership with the United States and other democratic partners in the Indo-Pacific. Now, how do we make it simply not military, but we make it about connectivity, we make it about economy, we make it about health in the current situation? I think those are the challenges that are going to be. Confluence, I don't want to take too much time, but I'd like to mention one area on which I think we can work much better now and much is pharmaceuticals, health, vaccine development. We have always worked well on science and technology, but I think this pandemic has given us a new focus, a new area on which India, as a major supplier of generic drugs, can work very closely with the United States. And I think there are several others, but I don't want to hog the mic. I'm happy to come back to you in the third lot. Thank you.
Right. I'm sure there'll be questions on that. I just want to take that point across to Richard Fontaine so that we have this. For everything that we talk about Namaste Trump and Trump's visit to India, we've also seen Prime Minister Modi in India have a relationship or a chemistry with Premier Xi in China, where you've had the Wuhan Connect or the Wuhan Spirit or the Chennai Connect. It may be troubled right now, the relationship between India and China, but from DC, how do you see this? Do you see that relationship as something that's not going to have a linear upward path, and it's only going to be the US-India relation that's going to have a linear upward path? Or do you think that there is a risk of India siding both sides?
Well, I don't think that U.S. policy can or does or should proceed from the assumption that the United States and India are going to be in a quasi-alliance against China. It is good for the United States and India to be closer together for all the reasons we've been discussing, including balance of power reasons, and that implicates the power of China. But there are limits to what that actually looks like in practice. If the United States were to go to India and say, cut off or somehow reduce completely your relationship with China so as to align fully with the United States, it would be a non-starter. And of course, if India were to say the same thing to the United States, it would be a non-starter. That's not how it's not a repeat of the Cold War with fully coherent divided blocks, and for no other reason than because of the strong economic relations that each of our countries has with China. And, Ambassador Sarna and others on this call will know better than I, but it does not seem the case to me that for whatever the strategic and troubles and the diplomatic tussles and the current disquiet between India and China, that the response of India is going to be to cut off its trade relationship with China or its economic relationship with China. I mean, it's just not in the cards any more than the United States is, for all the talk of decoupling with China, is actually going to do that. We're not. And so what we are looking at is something much more nuanced and complicated, which is a longer term alignment of the U.S. and India's aspirations and interests and activities within the context of continued strong economic relations with China from each of our countries. And so I think those are wrong who on the American side kind of say, well, this is, the border issue is the wake-up call India is needed to realize that, it needs to sort of treat China as the inevitable adversary and sort of swing our direction. It's a little more complicated than that.
Right. You said it's not like a Cold War era. I was just thinking maybe it's not yet like one. But I just want to get down to Richard Verma for one question. When we talk of the pandemic, we're not just, you were talking of people-to-people contact in your first comments. This is before I can get our special guests and panelists to ask questions to the panelists here. The pandemic also brings about an enormous economic recession across the board. Is that going to make countries look deeper within themselves and try and be isolationist? You've seen such trends across the board. And you spoke about democratic values, where you've seen a tendency towards authoritarianism, even in democratically elected systems, rise around the world. So how is the pandemic and the fact that it's going to bring about an economic recession perhaps going to impact these larger dynamics that we have spoken about, which become the foundation, as you say, of an Indo-US relationship?
Yeah, look, the great thing about our history, the U.S. history, is that we have some prior examples of leading a global effort through very difficult periods. World War I, World War II, the end of the Cold War. I mean, I think Americans should be proud of the role that various presidents and administrations have played in shaping a global response to very difficult times. And we are in that moment right now. Now, given what we know about the pandemic, it doesn't look like there will be any, one day where we all celebrate and say, where we sign a treaty and say this pandemic is now behind us. We are actually going to have to start working together today on developing the global pandemic response that we don't currently have. And as we look around the world at which country is actually going to step up and do that, that would normally fall on the backs of the United States. And we should be doing that. And I can think of no better partner to do that with than with our friends in India. As Ambassador Sarna said, we can do joint vaccine development. We can do so much in the health space. But there's a larger issue here about transnational threats broadly: pandemics, climate change, terrorism, cybersecurity. We need global mechanisms to deal with this. So each country may want to go nationalistic, may want to go self-reliant, may want to cut itself off from the world, may want to build walls, both real and metaphorical. But as I look out at the challenges that are going to confront us and other nations, they are transnational in their nature. That means we have to work with others. Again, I say there are no two better countries that could shape the modern global response to transnational threats than the US and India working together. I hope we can do that and lead a coalition together to do it.
You're hoping for a globalized nationalism across the world. Well, may I get now all our special guests to start with their first observations or questions. May I begin with Mr. Salil Gupte, President of Boeing India, who's joining us. Sir, if you can unmute yourself and perhaps post.
Yes, thank you very much. Hopefully I'm audible. A fascinating conversation. Thank you so much to the panelists, and the insight from the ambassadors is very important as they relate to talking about the non-linearity of this relationship as it has strengthened between the U.S. and India over the past several decades, as was mentioned, going back to Presidents Kennedy and Eisenhower. As businesses in India, Boeing in India, has over 3,000 employees in India now, and another 8,000 in our supply chain, and $1 billion of spend in India every year. We have to make investments for the long term. And so this means that, linear, not linear, step change in your steps back in the relationship, we can't allow that to affect our strategy, because we can't turn our investments on or off on an annual basis based on what's going on. We have to look where we think things are going and invest based on that. And the hundreds of millions of dollars that we've invested and billions of dollars that we spend has to be directed by that long-term perspective. And that long-term perspective is really driven by a couple of things. One, first and foremost, is the capability of our people in India, right? The capacity for innovation and talent is what draws us to India as we make many of these investments. And then, of course, there is the power of India as a market. For Boeing, of course, we have both civil aviation opportunities and defense opportunities. And so, as long as those things remain strong, regardless of what the sort of, directional changes are on a year-to-year basis, that's what we really tend to focus on. And, I'd love insight from the panel on, how we can, as companies can, continue to refine that long-term view to make those types of decisions.
Anyone in specific from the panel you'd like to address that question to?
I'd like to hear from, I guess, both ambassadors on that, as you know, looking beyond the year-to-year changes in sort of a long-term perspective.
Mr. Verma and Mr. Sarna, quick responses
I
to that
just
question.
I go very quickly. Thanks for the question. First, I've said this before, I'll say it again. The companies are ahead of the governments. You all move faster, you're more innovative, you're on the ground, you're doing things, you're making things, you're building things, you're employing people. And that's what you're going to have to continue to do, because as we pointed out, we're going to go through these ups and downs, bumps in the relationship. But to make you feel a little bit better, I think as you look out over the next decade, you know, when you go back to talk to your shareholders, the C-suite, the corporate board, I think you can assure them that A, this relationship is in pretty good hands, and B, the market opportunities in India, just the demographics alone, point to this being one of the most important markets in the world. And third, as we've talked about, we have this natural glue that holds us together. So I know you got to get through the kind of ups and downs of presidential elections and politics, but you guys keep your head down. You're in front of the governments, but the trend lines are good, and hopefully the governments will facilitate what you have to do and open more doors and more avenues of cooperation.
Right. May I now call Schmitt Asahi, Managing Director and Country Head, Pratt & Whitney, to make her observation and question. Ma'am?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Loud and clear.
Yes.
Yeah, good morning. Okay. I think you've called me on too soon, but probably it is a similar question to what, you know, Salil sort of referred to. It's more about the strategic and economic relationship of India and US. And I want to refer to, you know, India's emphasis on a self-reliant India in the current environment, and in the ongoing trade discussions with reference to the India-China context now, in the context of the downturn that the companies are facing in the middle of this pandemic. US has even suggested that there is a need for a group of friendly countries in Asia that should actually look at producing strategic goods for the US. However, in the ensuing conversations, and as we are discussing now, also with analysts, the summary is that any broader effort to restructure these well-established supply chains won't be so simple, you know, especially in the middle of this pandemic or the aftermath of the pandemic. You know, the companies are struggling to survive. So when we look at strategic global centers like India, where competitive benefits of production become even more important in the aftermath of the pandemic, you know, will US continue to look to India, or, you know, are we sort of wishfully thinking that the China supply chain might shift to India, you know, as a lot of discussions have been happening in India? So I would address to all.
Yeah, I thought it was an ideal question to get Mr. Richard Fontaine and Navtej Sarna into this. Richard, you want to go first response to that?
Sure. And we're already seeing in the wake of the pandemic, rethinking of supply chains, particularly among American companies that have suppliers and production in China, because the perception of risk is starting to dominate the other economic effects. Before, the obvious economic benefits of single source supply in places like China, whether it's labor costs, economies of scale, comparative advantage, all of those kinds of things obtained. Now there's both the fact that Americans have woken up to certain critical things like pharmaceuticals and things like that are made outside their country, which they're uncomfortable with. But as a broader phenomenon, the kind of political risk and other forms of risk associated with production in China, not just risk associated with the government of China, but also U.S. policy and it being indeterminate exactly what the tariffs are going to be and all these other kinds of things like that. So when you add all of this together, there's a set of incentives now that weren't previously there for at least American companies to move some production from China to somewhere else, right? I think it's a fantasy to think that that production is going to move all from China, from Wuhan to Ohio or something, although that seems to be the ambition of some of our policymakers. And if the question is it's going to move out of China, then where's it going to go? And so India and other places like Bangladesh and Vietnam and some others are obvious top candidates. So I think there is a segment of the supply chain and production that India is sort of tailor-made to pick up as companies want to move away from China. That said, I think there are limits to this because you hear in Washington a lot this notion that the United States and China are just going to kind of decouple their economies and companies will wake up and realize that they shouldn't produce things in China anymore. And that, I think, is just not realistic. I think it's undesirable from an economic perspective, and it's not realistic. So in, somewhere between zero, no change, and 100% full decoupling, we're looking at something, and what percentage of that is still remains to be determined, but it sure is not zero, and therefore India can be the beneficiary of it. So to that degree, I think it's a real opportunity for India and therefore for US-India relations.
Mr. Sarna, are we ready to take advantage of that change from zero to whatever?
Well, I think in the immediate aftermath or the outbreak of the pandemic, I think there has been a sort of global move, a global change in mindset, a realization that we are far too dependent on China for virtually everything, and that our production has suffered in the process. We feel it in India. It's felt in the United States. It's felt in several other countries. I think that is the immediate reaction.
Right.
Now the fact is, we have to actually make a real move on certain things. Some things may be easy to move, as Richard mentioned. Some things may not be easy to move. We also have to remember that the Chinese economy is probably the first off the block already in terms of recovery. So the Chinese are not going to let go of this easily. And there are many large companies who are not going to let go of the Chinese market simply because of this. So I think this dust has not settled, this ball has not stopped moving. There will be somewhere there will be a regaining of what I call the economic sovereignty. People want to know that they are in control of what they need. Where does it come from? And does it come, at least if not from within your country, does it come from a friendly country or a friendly set of countries? So I think you might see more regionalization of supply chains. You might see some movement to, what is called onshoring or reshoring your supply chains onto your own countries. And some of these things will still remain with China. So I think there's going to be sort of settled somewhere in the middle.
When you say friendly countries, I wonder how often friends will change in the post-pandemic world. Let me get the next special guest this evening, William Blair, country head of Lockheed Martin. Please go ahead, sir. Your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Great discussion. And, it really reinforces to me the foundation that we have in our relationship between U.S. and India and the future that can bring. Coming from Lockheed Martin's perspective, we invested in joint ventures over 10 years ago now with Tata Aerostructures for the C-130J empennage and also with Sikorsky joint venture on helicopter components. And why I mentioned that is, picking up on where my colleague Salil Gupta identified on Boeing's side, we really plan for a long-term business case. And it's proven to be, I'll say, very, very productive relationship. What we're doing meets our global supply chain requirement, not just unique to what an Indian requirement is. So really, we're making in India for the globe. And so looking forward with the recent acquisition order of MH-60 Romeo helicopters, I think it underscores how the relationship has moved from maybe transport aircraft to more capable aircraft, whether it's the Apache helicopter for Boeing or now MH-60 Romeo for its ASW capability. It provides an opportunity for both capability but also collaboration. And I was really struck at the Ricina dialogue earlier this year on how that came out so strongly in terms of the free and open Indo-Pacific. And my question, I guess, is that, where there's a long-term foundation established in many countries, there's strong bilateral and shared bilateral relationships, and looking at the Quad as an opportunity, and we look at US, India, Japan, and Australia as having a lot of shared interests in maintaining a free and open Indo-Pacific. And how do you see maybe the shared bilateral relations in the defense and security space evolving, where we can start to collaborate even more than we have today, whether it's cross navies or and expanding into the space domain, which essentially knows no boundaries? Thank you.
It's a very important issue and an interesting question that you've raised. Richard Verma, would you like to have a go at that? Do we expect Quad to really become a reality at some point of time, or this present world order will continue, or the present situation will continue linger on for a while?
No, I do. I think we are due for graduating into a more advanced operational relationship. There's no question in my mind. And I think, if you look at the 2000 to 2010 period, we were just starting to get to know each other operationally. The exercises started, the transfer of technology started. From 2010 to today, we have reformed our export control system. We have designated India a major defense partner. We have set up the Quad mechanisms. We are doing more advanced naval exercises, for example. We are starting to think and plan about humanitarian response. We have entered into our different logistics agreements and other foundational agreements. So we've kind of set the foundation up for that next phase. And unfortunately, the threats have not dissipated, right? I mean, as we look around what's happening in the Asia Pacific and globally, the threats remain. I continue to think we are a very natural partner for India, a very strong partner. I think we are a better partner than some of the others that India goes back to from its Cold War days. I think we are more reliable. And operationally and from a maintenance perspective, we do a better job. And on that score, I think that lends very well for this next chapter to start. This is one place where governments will have to really push. The industry can do its part, but government leaders are going to have to take us to this next chapter. But I think from a technology perspective and from a strategic perspective, we're ready to go there.
Right. I want a very quick response from Mr. Sarna on this. How much does geography have to be factored into this, despite the Himalayas?
You're asking me a very well-disguised question. Well, I think, India has the neighbors it has. And India has to have, a stable, friction-free periphery as we go on our path to development. That's the long-term objective. Right. So I think we will continue to work for a relationship with China which is not disruptive, which certainly, is not aggressive, and it works towards a certain stability. That having been said, I think both the recent events and China's overall rise and the manner of its rise, not an unobtrusive, inward-looking rise, but a very explicit, muscular, aggressive rise all over the world, I think that should give us reason to pause and think. And certainly, we are into a time of great power rivalry. We are into a possible world of the G2. And India, I think, will try its best not to get into a situation where you are seen as an ally of one against the other, as Richard Fontaine mentioned. I think nobody wants to be in that situation. But I think it will be a much more self-assured and also a realistic response to the global situation and the regional situation as to where exactly our bread is buttered, for what purpose. And I must say that we have a narrow space to maneuver. It's not just the country across the Himalayas. It's also Russia. We do have a very long-standing defense relationship. We do have legacy platforms. We do have issues of spares and so on. And so I think there's a narrow diplomatic space. And I think our success will be in how nimbly we manage to maneuver it. And ultimately, the answer lies in India's own strength.
Right. We cannot
India
stop.
must be strong enough, strategically, politically, and economically, to matter to every country.
Right.
Otherwise, we can't keep this equation balanced.
We will have to constantly keep peeking behind the iron and the bamboo curtain, I guess. The next panelist, next special guest, Nick Khanna, Managing Director, BAE Systems. Nick, can you please go ahead with your question or observation?
Yes, thank you very much. Absolutely fascinating discussion, gentlemen. My question comes, it sort of focuses on India's core military objective today is to acquire the capabilities to take on China on its own terms. We've talked about that today, not as part of a coalition. But we're seeing a decided shift towards self-reliance and domestic procurement as it looks to come out of the COVID-19 pandemic. We're also seeing the positive results, as has been said by both Bill and by Salil, of a 2-decade-strong U.S.-India defense relationship. The deployment of American military firepower that the companies on this call have proudly provided to the Indian Armed Forces in partnership with the USG. It's also been said that India, while it sees the US as a critical partner, there will be limits to what it wants from the US in managing its relationship with China. Richard Fontaine alluded to that. So how do you balance this need for military capability, all the work that we're doing as part of the US-India defense relationship, and this strong impulse to reduce import dependency today, and this move towards self-reliance, as India looks to counter Chinese assertiveness in the region over the long term, not just in the Galwan Valley, but in the IOR as well? How do you balance these two things within the context of this very strong nationalistic impulse right now in India?
Richard Fontaine, you want to take that?
Sure. Well, some of this isn't new. India's had fairly onerous offset requirements for years and years, which have been aimed to build up the indigenous capacity for production and so forth. And, some of this has been dealt with through talks on both sides that try to keep an eye on the bigger picture here of what we're trying to achieve in the defense relationship. There's other answers to this, like, joint production and co-development, including in ways that would have the benefit of building up the domestic Indian capacity to produce some of the things and to develop some of the systems that it wouldn't otherwise have the ability to do. So there are certain kind of win-win opportunities, I think, that are possible here in the abstract. But you do get to some tension, as you're alluding to, between wanting to be self-reliant and do it at home versus do things more closely with a defense partner who's far away. I think the best way to try to deal with this is to try to put philosophy to the side and deal with it on a case-by-case basis. What is the specific capability that the Indian Armed Forces would like to have that it doesn't already have, and what's the best way to do that in the context of closer U.S.-India defense ties? Some of this stuff can very easily get into philosophy, both on the Indian side and on the American side, about the way things ought to be, about the degree of self-reliance one should want in this world that we have, about the reliability of partners over the grand sweep of history. And at least in my experience, those conversations tend to be the least productive of ones I've ever participated in. If you can focus specifically on what is the capability, who has the ability to generate that capability, how can you actually go about doing it in a way that will benefit both sides? To me, that's the starting point for this. So I hope that gives a little sense of an answer to that question.
All right, stick to the point at the moment, Richard Fontaine. Surendra Ahuja, Managing Director, Boeing Defense. Your question, sir.
I think he had to drop off, is what I understand. He had another commitment.
I can't see him. So that's okay. Well, I think we've anyway run out of time. We're at 6:41 here on India time, which is 12 minutes more than this. So may I call Toby Simon, the main man who makes all this possible, for his remarks and what he thinks is going to be the future of India-US relations. Toby? Is the view from Bangalore different from the one in New Delhi?
I think it is about the same now with COVID impacting both Delhi and Bangalore. The same. I was talking to Richard. He says it's almost the same in Washington, except in the two parts that he lives. So my sense is that this is perhaps one of the elections in the US that Indians are very closely looking at for multiple reasons, which both Ambassador Sarna, Ambassador Rich Verma and Fontaine has mentioned. There's a lot of interest. But I feel that the defining moment in where all these push and pull will move will depend on who finds the vaccine first. And I think this is very similar to the Americans, to me, putting the atomic bomb on Japan. This is going to be the play which we want to watch. As we mentioned, China has a head start now, being able to cap the virus, at least to the best of knowledge that we know. So we need to see how that pans out, and I think we'll have to wait and watch. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Toby. Very quick responses from all three of our panelists. I would like to nudge you to make a prediction. One is the question that Toby has asked, who's going to make the vaccine first? The second is, I want to ask our guest from DC, what's your take on the US elections? Very quick responses from all three of you before we wrap this webinar.
Richard Fontaine, go ahead.
I hate to say I don't know and I don't know, but I think that's the honest answer. I don't know who will make the vaccine first. And what I do know about the presidential election is now everyone's reading the news and the polls and saying that Donald Trump is out of it. His response to coronavirus and Black Lives Matter and the economy and everything else has shown that people are swinging toward Joe Biden, and Joe Biden's got a significant lead. And I remember 2016, which was not that long ago, until 7 p.m. on election night, the polls were saying that Donald Trump was going to lose. And to everyone's surprise, perhaps including his, he came out ahead. So here, sitting in July, I think to say this is too early to call is the safest bet.
Right. Mr. Sarna, you want to make a quick prediction? Indians make very good cephalogists. You got to unmute yourself, sir.
I thought you were asking me about the vaccine. But I would just have one point to make on the vaccine. I don't know who's going to come out first, but I think it's very important for policymakers to be stressing that this vaccine should be treated like a public good. It should not become a victim to commercialization and the fact that only rich countries get it. So at the moment, there are reports appearing which do tend to give you that this is not just an idle thought, it needs to be actually predicted. As to the elections, I agree with Richard, it's far too early to call, But I think from what it looks like today, I think it's going to be a very close call, at the moment. It's still light years from now to November, if you're talking in terms of elections, and just about anything could happen.
Right. Richard Verma, your last word on this?
Sure. I'll just go back to a period when I was working in the Senate with Richard Fontaine, and the then chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee was a guy named Joe Biden. And he gave a speech about India, and he said, if in 2020 the US and India are the closest of friends and partners, the world will be a safer and more prosperous place. He was right then, and he will be right when he is president next year. So I'll leave it there.
Well, that's a strong prediction. Well, thank you so much, Richard Verma, Richard Fontaine, Navtej Sarna, and all our special guests who've joined this evening. We'd like to thank US-India Strategic Partnership Initiative, which has helped us in this webinar, as well as, of course, the Center for New American Security, with whom we'd carried this webinar out. But I'd like to remind all our audience, as well as the panelists, that way back in 2010, Synergia Foundation had a conclave in New Delhi, which had the then National Security Advisor of India, the then Foreign Secretary of India, and the National Security Advisor of India today, who were all part of that conclave. We made predictions then, most of that came true. Well, in 2020, we made predictions. Let's see where those are in a few years down the line. Thank you all for joining us. We'd like to leave you with images from 2010 of the Synergia conclave in Delhi.
Thank you.